Nightmare in the Ardennes. It was December of 1944, somewhere deep in the frozen woods of the Ardennes. Snow fell in thick, soundless waves, swallowing the world in eerie silence. The only thing breaking the quiet was the crunch of our boots as we moved cautiously through the trees. We were lost. Command had sent us out at dawn to scout for German positions, but the blizzard had turned everything into a white void. Our map was useless. The compass spun like it had lost its damn mind, and the radio was nothing more than a hunk of frozen metal. Captain Rawlings, a man with more scars than stories, had sworn he knew the way back. But after hours of wandering through the ghostly pines, I could see the doubt settling in his eyes like frostbite. I was the tail gunner in our squad, my Thompson held close to my chest, fingers numb around the trigger. We were a small group, 6 of us, including the captain. Jackson, our medic, kept muttering about how the cold would kill us before the Krauts did. Murphy, a kid from Brooklyn, kept his head low, trying to be invisible. There was Kowalski, big and mean as a bull, and then there was Andrews, who barely spoke but had eyes sharper than a hawk's. We were tired, frozen, and running out of patience. Then we heard them. Voices, faint but clear, cutting through the whistling wind. English. We all froze, glancing at each other. My breath came out in short clouds. American voices. Could it be? Captain Rawlings signaled for silence, raising a fist. We crouched low, gripping our weapons tighter. Through the snow-covered branches, we saw them, a small group of soldiers, huddled around a dimly lit lantern, their uniforms covered in frost. They looked like us. Tired, worn. One of them waved. Hey, you boys lost out here too. Something didn't sit right. I felt it in my gut, a slow churning that had nothing to do with the cold. Their uniforms looked right, their accents were dead on, but there was something off. They were too calm, too clean. No signs of exhaustion, no frost clinging to their beards or gloves. Rawlings hesitated, then stepped forward, his hand hovering over his sidearm. Yeah, we got turned around in the storm. You with the 23rd. A pause. Just a fraction of a second. Then the man nodded, too quickly. Yeah, 23rd. You boys need shelter. I glanced at Andrews. He was staring, unblinking, his fingers twitching against his rifle. He saw it too. Kowalski took a step forward, but Andrews grabbed his sleeve, stopping him. Something was wrong. Then, in the flickering glow of the lantern, I saw it. The patch on their jackets. A single stitch where something had been removed. My heart slammed into my ribs. They weren't American. The realization hit me like a bullet, and before I could react, before I could even breathe, the world erupted into gunfire. The first shot cracked through the frozen air, shattering the uneasy silence like breaking glass. I didn't see who fired first. Maybe it was Rawlings, maybe it was them. But within seconds, the dark woods exploded with muzzle flashes and the deafening roar of gunfire. My instincts kicked in before my mind could catch up, and I threw myself into the snow, gripping my Thompson so hard my fingers ached. The cold bit into my face as I pressed against the frozen ground, the acrid scent of gunpowder burning in my nostrils. Everything was chaos. Murphy dug behind a fallen tree, frantically reloading as rounds snapped past his head, splintering the wood into sharp, jagged shards. Kowalski, that big son of a bitch, was on his feet, firing in controlled bursts, his face twisted in a snarl. He didn't take cover, he never did, just stood there like a goddamn statue, unloading his bar into the enemy. Jackson was shouting something, his voice barely audible over the gunfire, but I couldn't make out the words. The only thing I could hear clearly was the pounding of my own heart and the sharp, panicked breaths that came with the realization of just how bad this was. They had set us up. The uniforms, the accents, the way they played it so damn cool. These Krauts weren't just soldiers. They were infiltrators, wolves in our own skin, speaking our language, wearing our clothes, knowing just enough to make us doubt our instincts. If Andrews hadn't caught that missing patch, if we had let our guard down even a second longer, we would have walked right into their trap, probably lined up and shot before we even realized what was happening. I rolled onto my side, raised my Thompson, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil kicked into my shoulder as a burst of rounds tore through the night. One of them dropped, a dark shape crumpling into the snow, but I didn't stop to look. Keep moving. Stay low. Find cover. These were the things drilled into my skull from the moment I set foot in boot camp. and they were the only things keeping me alive now. A shadow moved to my right, fast and low, and before I could react, a shape lunged at me. A knife glinted in the dim light, and then we were on the ground, rolling through the snow, his weight pressing down on me as he tried to drive the blade into my throat. I could see his face now, young, maybe my age, maybe younger. His eyes were wild, desperate, filled with something that wasn't rage, wasn't hate, just a raw, primal need to survive. I grabbed his wrist, twisting hard, but he was strong, stronger than I expected. The knife inched closer, the cold steel brushing against my skin. My arm burned with effort, my muscles screaming, but I couldn't let go, couldn't give him an inch. His breath came in ragged gasps, misting in the freezing air. His teeth clenched as he put all his weight into the blade. Then a gunshot. The force knocked him sideways, his body jerking as a red mist exploded from his chest. He slumped against me, lifeless, his blood steaming as it hit the cold ground. I shoved him off, gasping, my limbs shaking too hard to be from the cold alone. Andrew stood over me, rifle still smoking, his face unreadable in the dim light. He didn't say a word, just nodded once before turning back to the fight. The gunfire was slowing now, but that didn't mean it was over. I forced myself to my feet, scanning the battlefield. Bodies littered the snow, dark shapes motionless in the pale light. Some were ours, most weren't. The remaining Germans were retreating, disappearing into the trees like ghosts, their plan ruined, their ambush failed. They wouldn't stop, though. They would regroup, circle back, try again. We had to move. Rawlings was still standing, reloading with steady hands, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his helmet. Murphy looked rattled, his hand shaking as he wiped blood, his or someone else's, from his face. Jackson was kneeling beside one of our men. Kowalski. The big bastard wasn't moving. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I stepped closer. The snow beneath Kowalski was turning dark, soaking up something warm that had no place in this frozen hell. He had taken a round to the gut, a bad one. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his eyes flickering in and out of focus. "Shit," Jackson muttered, ripping open his bag, his fingers moving fast, desperate. "Stay with me, big guy. Just stay with me." But we all knew. Kowalski coughed, something wet and dark spilling from the corner of his mouth. He blinked up at us, then grinned, a small weak thing that looked wrong on his usually sharp face. "Hell of a fight," he rasped, his voice barely more than a breath. Then he was gone. No one said anything. We just stood there, the cold sinking into our bones, the weight of it pressing down like the snow-covered trees around us. It wasn't the first man we'd lost. It wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier. Rawlings was the first to move. "We need to go." No one argued. We gathered our gear, stripped ammo and supplies from the dead, and left Kowalski where he lay. There was no time for graves, no time for words. The storm was picking up again, the wind howling through the trees, erasing our tracks as quickly as we made them. We moved fast, staying low, sticking to the shadows. The Germans would be back, and we had no intention of being here when they were. But as we walked, as the darkness closed in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something, someone, was still watching. The forest swallowed us whole, a vast and endless expanse of darkness and towering pines that stretched on forever. The snowstorm had thickened, turning the world into a swirling white nightmare, erasing everything beyond a few feet ahead. The wind howled through the trees, a low and mournful wail that sounded almost human, like distant voices whispering through the frozen branches. We moved fast, but not fast enough. Every step was a fight against the cold, against exhaustion, against the weight of what had just happened. Kowalski was gone. Just like that. One moment he was standing, the next he was bleeding out in the snow, breath turning to steam that vanished before our eyes. We had seen men die before. Hell, we had seen worse. But this felt different. Maybe it was the way he smiled at the end, like he knew something we didn't. Like he had seen what was waiting for us out here in these godforsaken woods. Rawlings led the way, his eyes locked straight ahead, his face like stone. The rest of us followed in silence, our boots crunching through the deep snow, our hands gripping our weapons like they were the only things keeping us tethered to reality. Jackson muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't hear what. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a curse. Murphy kept glancing over his shoulder, his breath coming fast, his body twitching with a nervous energy that made my skin crawl. Something wasn't right. The fight was over. We had survived. We should have felt relief. But I didn't. None of us did. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that pressed down on my chest like an invisible hand. My pulse thumped in my ears, my skin prickling with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Andrews noticed it too. He didn't say anything, he never did, but I caught him scanning the trees, his fingers resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle, his body coiled tight like a spring. He had the best instincts out of all of us. If he was on edge, it meant something was coming. The minutes stretched on, each step dragging us deeper into the maze of ice and shadows. The snow muted everything, muffling the sound of our movements, making the world feel hollow and empty. I glanced at my watch, barely able to make out the numbers in the dim moonlight. Midnight, maybe later. Time didn't feel real anymore. Then we saw it. A cabin. It sat nestled between the trees, half buried in snow, its roof sagging under the weight of ice. The windows were dark, the doors slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like it had been here for years, waiting. Rawlings raised a fist, signaling for us to stop. We crouched low, our breath coming in quick, sharp puffs. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind and the distant creak of the door. "Could be shelter," Jackson whispered. "Could be a trap," Andrews muttered. Rawlings considered for a moment, then nodded toward me and Andrews. "Check it." We moved carefully, our boots sinking deep into the snow as we approached. The cabin loomed over us, its wooden walls dark and weathered, covered in patches of ice. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit space inside. A fireplace sat cold and empty against one wall. A table and a few chairs were scattered across the room, their surfaces covered in a thin layer of frost. A single bed rested in the corner, its mattress torn, stuffing spilling out like exposed guts. The place smelled of old wood and something else, something faint, something metallic. Blood. Not fresh. Old. Stale. Lingering in the air like a whisper of something terrible that had happened long before we arrived. Andrews nudged me, nodding toward the far side of the room. Footprints. Faint but visible, leading toward a door in the back. Someone had been here. Recently. I tightened my grip on my Thompson and stepped forward, pushing open the back door. A gust of wind blasted through, carrying a fine mist of snowflakes into the cabin. Beyond the threshold was darkness, nothing but trees and shadows. No signs of life, no movement. But the feeling was stronger now. We weren't alone. I turned back toward Andrews, but before I could say a word, a sound echoed through the trees. A voice, soft, distant, almost familiar. Murphy's face went pale. "That's Kowalski." And then the lantern on the table flickered to life. The flame in the lantern flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. None of us had touched it. None of us had even stepped close to it. But there it was, burning with an eerie, unnatural steadiness, as if it had been waiting for us. Murphy took a step back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "That's Kowalski," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear to God, I heard his voice. No one answered. We were all thinking the same thing, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. It wasn't possible. Kowalski was dead. We had seen him fall. We had left him behind in the snow, and yet, a second sound. Creak. Slow, deliberate, like a footstep on the old wooden floor. I spun toward the back door, my finger tightening on the trigger. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin walls, but beyond that, there was something else. Presence. Not just the sense of being watched, but something more. Something pressing down on us, thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. Andrews moved first, stepping toward the lantern. He reached out carefully, his fingers trembling just slightly, and then the flame went out. Darkness swallowed the room in an instant, thick and absolute. Someone cursed under their breath. I heard Rawlings snap, "Stay together." And then, from outside, a low, rasping breath. It was close. I could hear the others shifting, raising their weapons, trying to make sense of what the hell was happening. My own pulse was a drumbeat in my skull, my throat tight with something I couldn't name. Fear? No. This was something worse. A shadow moved in the doorway, Just a shape, barely visible against the swirling snow outside. But I knew. Somehow, before the rational part of my brain could argue, I knew exactly what I was seeing. Kolsky. He stood in the open door, his massive frame blocking out the storm behind him. His uniform was torn, his helmet missing, his body outlined in a dim, sickly glow from the pale moonlight outside. But his face was wrong. The eyes were too dark, too empty, like twin holes punched into his skull. His mouth hung slightly open, steam curling from his lips despite the freezing air. And his skin, already pale in life, was now an ashen gray, almost blending into the snow. Murphy whimpered. No. Kolsky took a step inside. The floor groaned under his weight. He moved slow, deliberate, like he wasn't fully in control of his own body. Snow dripped from his boots, melting into dark puddles on the wooden floor. Nobody moved. I wanted to raise my weapon, to aim, to fire, but I couldn't. Something held me in place, something deep and primal that told me this wasn't something bullets could fix. Jackson found his voice first. Kowalski. The thing in the doorway tilted its head. The motion was slow, almost mechanical, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. Then, in a voice that was barely a voice at all, just a breath, a whisper, a memory of sound. Left me. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Murphy sobbed, scrambling backward, knocking over a chair. Andrews was frozen, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Rawlings stood rigid, his hand hovering over his pistol, but not drawing it. Kowalski, or whatever the hell this thing was, took another step forward. The shadows around him seemed to stretch, warping unnaturally, twisting like living things. The air grew thick, heavy, filled with the coppery scent of blood and something else, something old, something rotten. Left me, he whispered again, but this time the voice wasn't just his. It was layered, echoed, filled with too many voices speaking at once, overlapping, distorting. And that's when I saw the others. Shapes in the snow outside, dozens of them, standing, watching. American uniforms, German uniforms, some missing helmets, some missing faces, all standing in the storm, motionless, their eyes dark, empty voids. And then, in perfect unison, they took a step forward. Panic hit like ice water down my spine. Rawlings moved first, breaking whatever spell had held us in place. Out the back now. Chaos erupted. We turned, shoving through the back door, stumbling into the freezing night. The storm howled around us, snow blinding, stinging, but we didn't stop. We ran. We ran like men who knew they wouldn't make it. The forest closed around us, dark and endless, the trees twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The wind carried voices, whispers, screams, laughter that didn't belong. And behind us, the sound of boots in the snow. Chasing, following, never stopping, never letting go.